Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox, the director. This week we have a special episode, a detailed look at one of the key questions in the world right now. Will the US continue to support Israel as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government test the limits of that relationship? And I will be speaking to one of the people best placed to answer that question. I'm joined today by Ambassador Dennis Ross, a key figure in US foreign policy for over 40 years. For more than a decade of that, he played a leading role in shaping America's policy in the Middle East. He did this under both a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, and a Democrat, Bill Clinton. More recently, he was a special advisor to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton during the Obama administration. Ambassador Ross has dealt directly with both Israeli and Palestinian parties in peace negotiations. He was instrumental in brokering agreements between the parties, including the key Oslo II or Taba Accord of 1995 and the 1997 Hebron Accord. He also facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty and worked on talks between Israel and Syria. So he has a unique perspective on the region, and specifically on America's relationship with Israel. Rarely has that relationship been so fraught or so important to the resolution of the conflict as it is at the moment. This week, it looked as if a ceasefire and hostage deal might finally be reached between Israel and Hamas, but it collapsed again amid accusations of bad faith from both sides. At the same time, Israel has moved on the Rafah crossing, and there's been talk of a further invasion of Rafah, the southern part of the Gaza Strip that is Hamas's last stronghold in the territory, but where more than 1 million Palestinians, already displaced, are trapped. The US has made very clear its strong opposition to that offensive, as has the UK and 26 of the 27 EU states. President Joe Biden this week said the US would stop supplying artillery and bombs if Israel went ahead. Yet Netanyahu, backed unanimously by his war cabinet, appears to have chosen to do just that. Meanwhile, protests on university campuses and student occupations of buildings in protest at Israel's action in Gaza are spreading in the US and Europe, bringing home just how much Israel's international support is in jeopardy, even, it seems, in the US, its supporter above all others. In our discussion, I'm going to ask Ambassador Ross first for his assessment of Israel's government's calculations and whether there is the chance of a deal at the moment, then about whether the US has real influence and intends to use it. And third, we'll return to the question of a resolution of this conflict and whether, with the help of other countries in the region, there might be the chance of a deal. With all of that to get into and more, I offer a very warm welcome to Ambassador Dennis Ross.
My pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. Let me start with this question of what is the calculation going on inside the Israeli government. What do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to do with pushing ahead with this move into Rafah?
Well, what they've done in Rafah so far is actually at the Rafah crossing. It's not in Rafah. It's about 3 kilometers from Rafah. So they're not actually in Rafah. Now, he has created, I think, some confusion about that. And obviously, it's come with a cost to his relationship with President Biden, because I think he's trying to convince the right wing of his coalition, the Messianic nationalists in his coalition, ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, that he intends to do Rafah. At this point, what Israel is doing is not doing Rafah, but I think it was designed to put pressure on Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, who is the head of the military wing of Hamas, the Izzedim al-Qassam Brigade. It's really the guy who runs Hamas in Gaza and is the guy who holds the hostages. So I think this has actually been something that was agreed by the war cabinet, meaning this includes Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, who have actually put as a very high priority recovering the hostages. I think they saw this as a lever, a pressure on Yahya Sinwar. I think President Biden has interpreted this as an indication that Bibi actually intends to go into Rafah, even though he hasn't lived up to the commitment he made to the president that he would ensure that Israel had put in place evacuation plans, meaning not only that you evacuated the 1.3 million people who were there, but you also had them go to places where there was shelter, food, water, medicine, and the like. If Bibi had really been serious about preparing the ground for going into Rafah, we would have seen Israel acting that way. We saw it this week some limited moves towards evacuation. And the irony is, this is when we actually saw Hamas go ahead and not necessarily agree to the proposal that had been put on the table, but in effect create the impressions they were saying yes and offering a counterproposal.
So let's just stop on that for a moment. Why, in your view, did this round of the talks about a possible deal, why did it break down?
I think it has broken down. I think now Hamas is probably seizing on what President Biden has said from the standpoint, why do we need to make a move now? Because we don't have to worry about Rafah. The U.S. is going to prevent Israel from going in. It's ironic for me that the president, who has been right to press for humanitarian assistance dramatically increased into Gaza and right to insist on evacuation plans, I think this position actually of at this point saying, in effect, Israel can't go in. If they go in, where they're going to deny them weapons, I think it is reducing the pressure on Hamas to do a deal. I think, there's probably a little bit of blame to go around. The Israelis clearly were surprised by the presentation of what was presented as Hamas saying yes. When they actually looked at the proposal, they saw this was not yes. There are some pretty profound differences between what the Israelis had agreed to that could be put on the table and that what Tony Blinken referred to as extraordinarily generous, and what is the actual proposal. So I think the Israelis were surprised by that. And including, again, in the war cabinet, I think they were distressed by what they saw as an imagery that Hamas was saying yes to something that wasn't that close to what Israel had been prepared to accept. I also think that you had Netanyahu over the course of last weekend, including on Shabbat, putting out statements which is highly uncharacteristic, explaining he was still going to go into Rafah and conveying an image that he wasn't going to be soft at all. And that was clearly designed to address what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were saying. I think that probably also affected, at least the tenor of what was being discussed.
But so in this dance that Netanyahu is carrying out, is it working, in your view, in bringing along the more hardline members of his government? Because we had a tweet, if we can still call it that, from Ben-Gvir today, the national security minister today, saying Hamas loves Biden with a heart symbol instead of the loves, which went in its way around the world. It doesn't seem to be persuading them.
I think the issue is less persuading them and just sort of keeping them in the government. So far, they're still in the government, and that seems to be the measure for Netanyahu right now. And so the problem has been, how does he manage the various pressures that he's under? So he's under pressures from the U.S. He's under pressures from other members of the war cabinet. He's under pressures from the people on the far right of his cabinet, of his coalition. And he's juggling all this. And he also has to juggle what's actually happening on the ground in Gaza. And here you have tactical military achievements, but they're not connected to a strategic objective. That's a basic problem that he has, and I think is creating some of the tensions within Israel, by the way, on all sides. It certainly creates a lot of tension with the hostage families. It's raising questions about, okay, what's the direction of this? It raises questions with people like Gadi Eisenkot and Gantz. And then it raises questions on the part of those of the far right who have a very different kind of strategic objective, which is they want Israel to stay in Gaza. They want to see effectively Palestinians leave Gaza. Bibi himself has publicly said, we're not going to stay in Gaza. We're not going to be pushing Palestinians out. But that's not where the far right is coming from.
And we're already in this conversation right into the detail of the tactics. I did ask you about the Israeli government's calculations. But if we take a step back, we look at the campuses in turmoil around the world, the occupations of buildings and so on. Israel is losing an awful lot of support, including among people in the younger generation in countries where their governments, anyway, are very much supporting Israel. So there is a huge cost here. Do you think that this government, led by Netanyahu, is capable of acting in what you might call Israel's interests, long-term interests, given all the pressures on it? And I have in mind a book you wrote about 3-4 years ago called Be Strong and of Good Courage, about Israeli leaders who did, in your view, act in their country's interest, not that of their party.
No, I think when we look at this current government is not capable of dealing with the real challenges that Israel faces. And certainly this government, it contributes to a shift of public opinion away from Israel. To be fair, they're not the sole cause of it, but they don't have the ability or the discipline to create just one message coming out of Israel. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich feel free to say whatever they want, and they can say things that completely undercut what the Israeli government is doing and deepen an impression that is the worst possible impression about Israel's purposes. So they don't represent Netanyahu, and they seem to have not the slightest qualm in undercutting him and his message publicly. This is a government that, as long as Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, in effect, are to some degree, an arbiter of what it does, it will find it very difficult to reverse the trends we're seeing internationally.
So let's jump to our second theme, which is the nature of the US-Israeli relationship at the moment. And again, the US president forced into tactics. He's got political considerations of his own, but he's also having to work with someone under immense tactical pressure, as we've just been discussing with Netanyahu. How do you think Joe Biden is doing in handling this?
Look, I think he's, again, given who he is and his basic belief system and even his own division of good versus evil, he looks at Hamas for what they are. What he sees October 7th, as he said the other day up on the Hill on Holocaust Remembrance Day, he said, some people may have forgotten October 7th. I haven't. So this helps to define who he is. He has always had an emotional connection to Israel. He looks at Israel as being the only democracy in the region, and he thinks we have an obligation, a historic obligation, to maintain our commitment to it. But he also has a sense of limits as well. And from very early on, he's tried to push the Israelis on the issue of humanitarian assistance. And I think there's been a couple of points where we've seen him kind of flip. I call one a tipping point. The mistaken killing of the 7 aid workers as part of the World Central Kitchen convoy. He had been frustrated by promises Netanyahu had made to him and not fulfilled. And then this happens. And for him, he looks at these are 7 people who are being purely selfless. And okay, it wasn't done by design, but for Biden, it indicated there was too cavalier an approach to the use of force without sufficient concern in his mind for some of the consequences of it. And I think that was building in him. And so then this comes along, and that was kind of a tip point. Then he was very tough in a conversation with Netanyahu, and we saw an immediate reaction from it. Suddenly Israel was prepared to use Ashdod port, to open Kerem Shalom, to open a crossing point in the north, things it had not been prepared to do before and had been withstanding for 6 months. Suddenly that changed. And that was a function of Biden making very clear, we're going to reassess our whole position unless I see this happening. So that was, I think, number one. The more recent one is what he just did in terms of the announcement, which is, in my mind, as I said a little earlier, this, I think, was actually a mistake from the standpoint of the administration's own priority with regard to getting a hostage deal. Because I think it absolutely let Sinwar come to think, okay, I don't have to worry about Rafah. I don't have to worry about any military pressure now. And you're just not going to get Sinwar he's never going to rush to a deal to begin with. And now if you've taken the pressure off of him, you've reduced, in a sense, what was one of the administration's most important priorities.
And let's be clear, we're talking about the statement when Biden said, look, if you go ahead with Rafah, I'm not going to supply bombs and artillery.
And again, that's also in keeping with who Biden is. I've said to you that there has to be more care taken in terms of how force is being used. I don't disagree with you that you have a right when it comes to Rafah to be sure there aren't Hamas battalions operating there. I don't disagree with you that you have a right to make sure that the smuggling tunnels get shut down there. In a sense, Biden has been saying, I don't disagree what the objective has to be on Rafah. I disagree with how you're going about doing it or you're planning to go about doing it. The irony is, it's probably the way to rescue the current moment by having the two sides sit down and say, okay, let's work out what is the right way. Let's work out, how you're going to do the evacuation. Maybe we'll even help you in terms of the evacuation, in terms of getting material in to be able to absorb people. That would allow Biden to sort of move off from where he is. And in the end, it allows you to reestablish some of the pressure on Sinwar.
Just before we get on to Sinwar, just on the nature of the pressure that the US can put onto Israel, when Joe Biden has one of those tough conversations with an Israeli prime minister, particularly Netanyahu, what is it he is threatening to do? As you said, there's a deep bond between the US and Israel. He's not threatening to cut that bond completely. So what is the nature of the pressure these days?
Well, I think we're seeing it right now, that he's actually saying we wouldn't provide offensive weaponry. Now, if you think about it, not only does that, as I said, does that reduce the pressure on Sinwar, but it also, if you're Hezbollah and you're Iran, and this is emerging, it may actually increase your sense that there's more that we can do. So I'm not sure that's the right instrument to use, but it is an instrument that he has chosen to use. There are other instruments, obviously. In some cases, just like what they were doing a week ago, which is actually, I thought, a smart thing. Don't announce that you're doing a slowdown in arms for the reasons I said, because you're sending messages to others too. But you can basically quietly say, look, unless we see the following, we have all sorts of difficulties getting certain things to you right now, which has the virtue of being true. But you take advantage of those difficulties. I mean, we have, because of what we've been providing Israel, because of what we've been trying to provide Ukraine, there are real logistic issues in terms of material availability of material. This is not being made up. But you choose your priorities, and you figure out what you're going to move and how you're going to do it. And you could decide just to go slow in a very practical way, but you could quietly communicate that too. When you go ahead and you broadcast it, as I said, you're conveying messages to multiple parties, not just to the Israelis. They know what they need. No one needs to tell them what they need. They know it better than anybody else. So that is clearly one lever that the administration had, and in my mind, they could have exercised it that way. They have other levers as well. I mean, it's not just the bully pulpit, which is important, but it's also, I have always believed that we're right to protect the Israelis at the Security Council. But we also have, when Israeli leaders say, at the end of the day, we're the ones who have to make our own decisions. It's fair enough. But the response is, at the end of the day, we can make our own decisions too. So, if we have disagreements, it's fair to have disagreements, but don't expect us to support policies that we disagree with.
Is the US at the moment trying to put pressure on Israel over the West Bank? Settlers have been very active. There's been a lot of violence. This is an old issue on which you have spent a good deal of your life, and we've seen the expansion of Israeli settlements, but it has been rather eclipsed by world attention on what's going on in Gaza. What is the US doing at the moment about that?
The administration has imposed sanctions for the first time on a number of the settlers. And they're making quite clear they're prepared to expand those numbers of people that they will sanction. Now, sanction means it creates a problem, not just, they don't just have to have finances or bank accounts in this country. These are, if they have bank accounts in banks that do correspondent banking relations with us, that also applies. So it's a serious sanction on these individuals, and they pay a real price. And it's not been done before. So it's a threshold that's been crossed. You have Smotrich again, who part of the problem is Smotrich, while the world is focused elsewhere, he's pushing to change the realities on the ground. He's a genuine ideologue. This is not a guy who, he's trying to do this for narrow political advantage. He actually believes this is his view. This is his worldview. This is what he believes has to be the case. And as I said, I describe him as a messianic nationalist. And if you buy into that ideology, a lot of things follow from it. He is trying to change the realities on the ground in the West Bank. So I think we can't take our eye off that ball.
What significance do the campus protests have? Are we looking at the beginning of a big change in America's feelings about Israel?
I'm not sure. I think there is a shift, certainly among the younger demographic. I'm not sure the campus protests are the best indication of that. I do a lot of speaking on campuses. And one of the things I find is that those who are in the encampments represent a really small percentage of people on the campuses. And I'm not sure that the kind of slogans they've adopted necessarily resonate with the rest of the students. They're They certainly have created prominence and a lot of noise, and administrations are trying to work out understandings with them, in some cases conceding to them. But I'm not sure they represent a cutting edge in terms of shaping what the next generation's views are going to be. I do think the war and the images from this war are having an impact on the younger demographic. And I do think that you asked me earlier about, can this Israeli government contend with that? And my answer was not, given its current makeup. I do think the next Israeli government is going to have a real mission to try to reestablish the image of Israel, what it stands for, what its values are. It's going to have to do, I think, very serious outreach, because I think there is a change here for sure. I'm not sure the campus protests are the embodiment of that, but I do think that there's an attitudinal change that's taking place. It's mostly age driven, so you feel it's much more prominent among younger people than among the older cohort. But Israelis would be wise to recognize this is significant.
We were expecting this week on Wednesday, but no sign yet, a State Department report that Biden agreed to in February about whether Israel has abided by humanitarian law in Gaza. As I said, it was due to be delivered to Congress this week. Do you think that's going to have impact?
I think a lot that will depend upon what it is. I mean, at this point, I can anticipate there may be some of this is likely to be ambiguous. And we'll say that we need further investigation. We want to have further conversations with the Israelis to where we see that there may have been transgressions, that we want to see them take the steps to correct it. I suspect that's how the administration is going to deal with this.
Let's just turn then to the region and back to the point we started on, whether there is a chance of a deal. And by that, I mean first some kind of ceasefire, but even possibly leading to some kind of agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. As I said, you've spent many decades on this, and that has proved elusive. But what do you make of where we are now?
I feel like we have reverted to 1948, meaning we're back to the point where this is kind of an existential question again. The level of disbelief, not distrust, disbelief between Israelis and Palestinians could not be more profound. We have two parallel sets of traumas, two societies that are experiencing trauma. And one of the realities of trauma is that your capacity to feel anybody else's pain is almost non existent. You're consumed by your own pain, but you can't feel anyone else's. And that's the way the Israelis are right now. It's the way the Palestinians are. So the idea that we're going to launch a major peacemaking effort in a climate where there's such disbelief doesn't fit the reality. The question is, are there new factors in the equation that we can try to draw on? And here I think there is some potential. If you bring the Arabs into play a different role than they played historically, not to make peace in place of Palestinians, but to use their readiness to make peace with Israel to also move the Israelis in terms of steps they would take towards the Palestinians. Now that can't mean that it's only the Israelis who take steps. Palestinians too have to take steps. Asking Israelis to make fundamental concessions towards Palestinians, if Palestinians are going to be led by Hamas, is unrealistic. And frankly, Arab leaders in the end aren't really going to want to be. They're not going to want to see a Palestinian state emerge that's led by Hamas. They're not going to want to see a Palestinian state emerge that is part of the Iranian axis of resistance. They're not going to want to see a Palestinian state that emerges that's a failed state. So I think we can work with Arab states and that we can work with Israelis and Palestinians. I think we start with Israelis and Palestinians just trying to reestablish, when this is over, trying to reestablish functional cooperation on functional issues, health issues, water issues, economic issues, quality of life issues, not as a substitute for a political process, but as a basis in which to reestablish for both sides to see they can actually do something together. Because we are so far from that right now that's almost has to be a starting point.
You hear a lot of countries talk about a two-state solution, a lot of the countries in the region, a lot of countries in Europe, but for just the reasons, I think, myself, of the trauma you've described on each side, you don't hear it from many Israelis or Palestinians.
And that's because of that trauma. those of us who want to see a different future, we have to recognize that trauma and then develop strategies to deal with it. Some of it is done in parallel by working with each side. Some of it, as I said, is creating these functional relationships again. One of the interesting things, just to give you an idea about when politics intervene, very early on, the Israeli health ministry just gave to the Palestinians vaccines and tests for COVID. At a political level, the Palestinian Authority was rejecting it. But the Palestinian Health Ministry ignored the political level. The Israelis ignored, meaning the health ministry people, ignored the political level people and just did it because they understood the simple reality. Because what it does is both peoples have to be reminded, they can do things together. That has to be reestablished. We have lost that. We are so far removed from the way things used to be in the 1990s. There's a lot of reasons we failed in the end. But what Israelis and Palestinians did on the ground together, what the Israeli and Palestinian negotiators, the way they were together, I'll tell you a brief story just to give you kind of the flavor of this. When we brought we had both negotiating teams at Bolling Air Force Base. And at the time, Yasser Abdul-Rabo was the head of the Palestinian negotiating team, and Oded Iran was the head of the Israeli one. And Oded had been the deputy chief of mission here, knew Washington very well. And at one point, Yasser became ill. And so, we have flight surgeons, we have doctors at the base. And so I was going to arrange to have the leading doctor at the base, have him see Yasser and take care of him. And Oded wouldn't hear of it. He said, he's a military doctor. Maybe he's good, maybe he's not. Oded knew one of the most prominent doctors, internists in Washington, and had a personal relationship with him. He called him up, and the doctor agreed he'd drop all of his other patients and he would see Yasser, and Oded drove him there. He wouldn't even hear otherwise. They had these personal relationships, which you can't even imagine today. So we have to get back to creating connections between the two peoples. It's not a be-all and an end-all, but to think that you can make real progress without that is also an illusion.
I find that completely persuasive, even if I'm feeling rather far off at this point. You're talking about new factors. Do you think Saudi Arabia is one of them? It's made no secret about its desire for normalization with Israel. This was before October 7th. A long list of things it would like from the US, including civil nuclear power, security guarantee, or so on. And it clearly would like a resolution of this.
For sure, because the Saudi priority is domestic. They want to take Vision 2030 and turn it into a reality. They want a region that is calm, and the risk of disruption or threats or instability, they want it removed. That's one of the reasons they want a defense treaty with the United States as a deterrent. But it also realizes after what's happened since October 7th that you can't ignore the Palestinian issue, and it has to be dealt with. It doesn't mean that they want to assume a major responsible role in terms of settling the conflict, but they want this removed as a continuing sore. So they are requiring what they call an alternative approach to the Palestinian issue that is sufficiently credible that it shows it's different than everything that's come before. The challenge is to produce something that's completely different than before and offers a kind of guaranteed outcome, while at the same time making sure that the Palestinian state that's going to emerge is a state that contributes, as I was saying, to stability, not instability, that is committed to coexistence, not to rejection. So you actually have to create kinds of benchmarks for Palestinian performance, even as you create some benchmarks for Israeli performance. I think that is the way to be able to take advantage of Arab states who are prepared to have a relationship with Israel, but require something from the Israelis on the Palestinians. And that can give the Israelis a stake in doing it because they have something strategically to gain. But one of the interesting things right now, really 2 points. One, we saw on April 14th, when Iran launches more than 300 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones at Israel. 1/3 of the cruise missiles and drones were intercepted by the U.S., by the British, and by the Jordanians and other Arab partners under Central Command, proving that the concept of a regional coalition is not an abstraction. We actually saw it in action. And it relates to the second point. Israel is facing, by the IDF's count, 7 fronts. The Israeli ethos has always been, we defend ourselves by ourselves. From the U.S., we want the means, but we don't ask you to play a role. What we just saw on April 14th, for the first time, we saw others playing a role actively in Israel's defense. And it's in Israel's interest because dealing with Iran and all of its proxies, maybe Israel can do it on its own, but it is really expensive to do it on its own. So this becomes an argument. You face, Hamas in the end, they're not an existential threat to you. Iran might be, but here's a way to deal with Iran and the proxies. So it's in your security interests. So you have something that shows a potential that is not an abstraction. And it can relate as well to, in a sense, dealing with the Palestinian issue. Whenever I assess a situation, especially this one, which I have spent so much time in my life thinking about, probably more than I want to contemplate, I always say, what's new in the situation? What possible element did we not have before that we have now? And how can we use that to try to change an equation that otherwise looks like a stuck?
I find that really inspiring as an approach. If we add then one new factor in the equation, the possibility of Donald Trump in the American election, what difference would that make? And do you think parties are going to hang on, thinking it might make a big difference and that it's really very hard to make progress before then?
Look, I think he takes some pride in the Abraham Accord. So, depending upon who he has working for him, if he comes in, one could envision him wanting to get something done in this regard. He's always said that he's a deal maker, and this is like the biggest deal to be made. I'm not sure that he played much of a role in it, but if he has people who are capable of following up on that, that's one thing. There is a problem. If he becomes president, he will not be able to produce a defense treaty because he will not be able to get it through the Senate. The numbers are such that while Republicans will support this, Democrats will not. They'll only support it, if you have Biden as the president. So you pretty much, to get a defense treaty, which is very much what the Saudis want, that, and they want a partnership in the development of their civil nuclear industry, a full partnership. And both those might require some kind of congressional action. Certainly the defense treaty requires the Senate to approve it. But depending on what's being done on the nuclear issue, that also might require some kind of congressional approval. So it's much easier to see it get done in a Biden presidency than if there's a Trump presidency. On the other hand, as I said, I think that Trump probably has some interest in showing that he's contributing to peace in the region. I think Trump would be much more problematic when it comes to the whole American alliance system.
May I ask you one final thing? I said we'd come back to Sinwar, and you were talking earlier as if you were absolutely convinced he is still in Gaza, perhaps surrounded himself with a lot of the live hostages. I was at a European Union embassy last night, with a gathering of people not unfamiliar with this region, many of whom seemed to think that Hamas leaders would have removed themselves from Gaza by this point.
It is possible. It's possible that because there are these smuggling tunnels, obviously by definition they move both ways. For whatever reasons, the Israelis have an extremely high degree of confidence that Sinwar is still in Gaza and that he is surrounded by probably at least a dozen hostages.
And with that, we're going to have to bring to an end this special episode of Independent Thinking. But a very big thank you to Ambassador Dennis Ross. To follow him on X at Dennis Ross, 2 N's in Dennis, and read his work at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, you can follow all of our work at Chatham House on these issues, taking up a great deal of our energy and thinking at the moment, this whole region. Visit our website, chathamhouse.org, where you can find out more about our Middle East and North Africa program and the US and Americas program and all the others. We had an event just this week addressing some of these questions with 2 key figures from recent US administrations. That was Dr. Colin Kahl, former US Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications. Do look online for that recording. And I'd like to flag up, too, a remarkable event we had with Hungary's Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó, where he set out, smiling but trenchant, Hungary's intentions for its presidency of the EU. It's caused quite a stir. Next week, we're going to be talking about the UK's foreign policy as we launch a big new report, which I've written with Olivia O'Sullivan, head of our UK and the World programme, and that is about the decisions in foreign policy that the next UK government really needs to get right. A reminder that you can find all of our podcasts on Apple, Spotify, all major platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and leave us a review. With that, it's goodbye for me, Bronwen Maddox. Until next week.